The Executive Director of UN Women there, ahead of International Women's Day. Well, we're going to talk about that with our next guest, but there's a lot of other things to discuss too. The Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy, joins us now from Wigan. Thank you so much for being on the programme this morning. I just want to start with the budget. One of the most significant things to come out of the budget was this freeze in income tax levels. Now, I was kind of under the impression that Labour supported that, but reading The Observer that you're going to vote against it. Can you clear up what is Labour's position?
We are going to vote against it this week. We think that now is absolutely the wrong time to be targeting low and middle income earning families for tax hikes and squeezing their incomes, not least because if you do that, it means that they're not going out and spending on the high streets, and the economy, the recovery is very fragile at the moment. We were really concerned when those plans were announced that what the government was effectively saying was that low and middle income earning families would be targeted to start paying into the system a full year before many of those major corporations, because the corporation tax rise doesn't come in until a year later. The Shadow Chancellor pushed the Chancellor on that at the dispatch box. We couldn't get a satisfactory answer. We think this is the wrong thing to do, so we'll be voting against it this week.
You say that the Shadow Chancellor pushed on this, but at the same time it does feel like it's been a bit of a change of heart. You didn't oppose it earlier in the week, and the Shadow Chancellor told my colleague Kate McCann on Wednesday it would have been the wrong decision to do it now, but more sensible to take these measures in the future. I mean, it is a year in the future. It feels like there's been a change of policy here. Is that a bit opportunistic?
No, we've been absolutely consistent about this, that we don't want to see low and middle income earning families paying the price for this pandemic.
But just to come in here, just to come in, if I may, because you've made the point on low and middle income earners a few times, and yes, I accept that it will impact them, but it does affect higher rate taxpayers more, doesn't it? It's not targeted at lower incomes.
It does, but we've been consistent in saying that the recovery is very fragile. There are businesses in this country, including many in my constituency here in Wigan, that just haven't been open for most of the last year because we've been in almost permanent lockdown in parts of the north of England. And what they most need to see is families going out and spending again when we start to unlock. They're looking forward to that. They think they can survive if we do that. But if you start to target those families too quickly, what you'll see then is the recovery choked off before it's even begun. We're also very concerned about the fact that buried in the small print of this budget was a council tax rise for those families. We're going to see cuts to universal credit coming in 6 months. What you're hitting families with is a perfect storm where their incomes are going to be squeezed from multiple directions, and we just think that is the wrong thing to do. It's the wrong thing to do for those families, but it's also the wrong thing to do for the economy.
Just wonder if it sounds to some like a bit of a cake and eat it approach. You're voting against tax rises. You want to see more public spending on things like nurses' pay, for example, because you're also, of course, saying that the government's planned 1% pay rise for nurses isn't enough. What do you want to see?
Well, I don't think this is a have your cake and eat it approach. I think this is entirely in step with most major economies. If you look over at the United States, Joe Biden is putting in a fiscal stimulus package worth trillions. The European Union is following suit. I think there is an economic consensus that the way in which we're going to get through this is to make sure that we protect businesses and workers right now. And actually, there was an argument about that in the Conservative Party, but ultimately that is an argument that the Chancellor accepted by delaying corporation tax rises in this budget. We want to see money going into the pockets of low earners, hard-working low earners, including low and middle earners in the National Health Service, who deserve it, who've got us through this crisis, who've gone out and worked every single day, were promised a pay rise and should get, at the very least, what they were promised. That is the way that you get the economy moving again. We saw that in 2010 when we had a huge deep cuts to the public sector. It took money out of the pockets of working people and it choked off any prospect of recovery in towns like mine. We cannot afford to keep making these mistakes again.
The question was about nurses' pay. You say that the government's planned a 1% pay rise that isn't enough. What pay rise do you want to see?
Well, the government, to be clear, is not planning a pay rise. Buried in the small print of this budget was not only that
but what do you want to see? I'm just trying to work out. What's Labour calling for.
Yeah, I'm just making the point that that is a real terms pay cut because it doesn't keep pace with inflation, and for nurses to be offered a pay cut is just reprehensible in our view. In the NHS long-term plan, the government budgeted for a 2.1% pay rise. That is what nurses were promised, and last year they legislated for that in order to give nurses a cast iron guarantee that after years and years of seeing their real terms pay fall, that the government would finally reverse that situation and start to see their pay increase. We think they ought to go into these negotiations at a bare minimum, honouring that promise of 2.1%, and then considering what more they can offer to our NHS staff who have done so much to put their families and themselves at risk every day going into work. Some of them have died. What can they offer to our NHS workforce who've done so much for us?
So what are you calling
over and
for,
above
though?
that 2.1%?
What do you,
Well, we think at the very minimum, they must honour that commitment that they wrote into law at 2.1%. And then there is a process ongoing where a pay review body rightly looks at this independently of government. They will make recommendations to government, but we think nurses deserve a pay rise this year, and that should never have been something that was up for negotiation. This is a government that's completely got its priorities wrong. If they can give a special advisor who broke the rules a 50% pay rise, but then offer our nurses a real terms pay cut, that is a government that just has not understood who it is that is getting us through this crisis and who deserves to be fairly rewarded.
The Royal College of Nursing says it's preparing for possible strike action. Would you support nurses striking?
Well, look, I'll always support nurses. I've always supported NHS staff since I was elected 11 years ago. But nurses in my constituency who I met last week are not asking me for a strike. They weren't promised a strike. They were promised a pay rise. And that is what I'm determined that they're going to get. A pay rise and the resources for the National Health Service that last year the Chancellor said would absolutely categorically be delivered. He said we will give the NHS whatever it takes. And instead, buried in the small print of this budget was an £8 billion cut for the NHS. They were promised a pay rise. They were promised resources for the National Health Service, and that is what I'm determined to stand shoulder to shoulder with our nursing staff in order to make sure that the government delivers.
OK, now children, of course, returning to the classroom tomorrow. Big news for pupils, teachers and parents, of course. In secondary schools, teachers and pupils are going to be told that they should wear face masks unless they're exempt. It's non-binding guidance, though. Does Labour think it should be a legal obligation?
I think all the way through this health crisis, when we've met with SAGE scientists and had regular briefings, they've been absolutely clear that you can't enforce public health. You have to carry people with you. And I think going down a route of enforcing, compelling students to take actions is probably not the right approach. It's not the right approach for students, for parents, and many teachers in my constituency have been telling me that they feel that that would be unenforceable. I think what we really need to see is a wider plan of action to help people comply with the measures. On testing, for example, there are a number of parents who are very worried about their children being tested. One of the reasons for that is because many parents can't afford to self-isolate at the moment if their child's test comes back positive. So we've been pushing the government to extend the self-isolation payment. 70% of people who apply for it are rejected, and that's why one of the reasons why only 3 in 10 people are actually doing it. So I think there are other measures that we could take rather than trying to force teachers to go around policing mask wearing and other measures in schools that would actually be far more effective.
Now, I'm keen to ask about Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe as well, the British mother in jail in Iran. Now, her sentence is due to come to an end today, but her husband, Richard, basically said he doesn't know what's going to happen. Do you have any intelligence on what is likely to happen to Nazanin and what should be done?
I don't. It's been frustratingly slow in relation to progress on this issue. And when I met with Richard Ratcliffe recently, it was clear how difficult this process has been. The family are very keen to continue to have the support of the Foreign Office, but I think I can say, frankly, that there just hasn't been enough focus and enough effort, not just on Nazanin's case, which is heartbreaking, but also on the other British dual Iranian nationals who are currently being held in Iran. We need to see much more progress on this. When I meet this family, I just feel that there's not much more that they can take of this, to be honest. And other countries have made more progress in getting their nationals home. We need to see a really concerted effort now across government, led by the Prime Minister, to make up for some of the mistakes that he's made in the past and to make sure that we get Nazanin home and other dual nationals home as well.
OK, now, of course, it's International Women's Day tomorrow, and it does feel, if you look at the data, that the pandemic has had a disproportionate impact on women, particularly mothers. 17% of mothers have had to give up on work during the pandemic, 72% have cut their hours. Mothers on the lowest incomes, 9 times more at risk of losing their jobs. Are you worried that the pandemic could set back women's progress in the workplace, potentially by years, decades?
I am worried about it. One of the things that we've seen over the course of this pandemic is a rise in working from home. That's obviously had a huge effect on people's ability to deal with caring responsibilities, not just childcare, but care for elderly parents as well. But there is a gap between the numbers of women who intend to return full-time to the workplace if they get the choice and the numbers of men who do. And there is a concern that that could continue to widen those inequalities. You know, the people who are in the workplace, far more visible, far more likely to be making decisions, far more likely to be promoted. So I think there's a risk that as we come out of this, we could see those inequalities that have widened already during the pandemic widen even further. I'm particularly concerned that women lack an obvious champion within government and that these issues that often end up being invisible as a consequence. I was listening to your last interview with real interest. It's fairly obvious that the more women you have at the highest levels making these decisions, the less likely it is that women become an afterthought in decisions that are made. So I think this is something that the government absolutely does need to take seriously and start to address.
Talking about having women in leadership roles, it's 2021. Labour still hasn't had a female leader. I know you ran yourself, but not only that, but when Labour members have gone, you did try, to be fair. But when Labour members have gone to vote in the ballot for their preferred candidate, a woman hasn't even placed above a man. I mean, that's pretty depressing, isn't it?
I think it is frustrating for Labour, and I won't dress that up. I found it particularly frustrating in the leadership contest to hear, you know, some of the things that women often hear when they're putting themselves forward for leadership positions. You haven't got the experience, it's not your turn. There were, you know, you don't look like a Prime Minister. I wasn't the only person to hear those. I think Becky Long-Bailey heard quite a bit of that, and so did the other candidates who weren't men. That is really frustrating. That's something that I'm absolutely committed that we're going to start to turn around and change. But I have to say that, you know, since that leadership contest, working with Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner, I know that's something they're absolutely committed to. We've got our first ever shadow female Chancellor of the Exchequer. I'm the first BAME woman to ever hold the post of Shadow Foreign Secretary. You know, if you look at Labour's top team, we've got women in those key positions. And I just hope that by being in those positions and by standing up and providing a strong challenge to the government and an alternative about how to bring Britain forwards, that we are showing the way that women can be in those leadership roles, and that, you know, ultimately that will change and that we will have a female leader at some point in the future. Not yet, I should hasten to add. But,
not going to run again, just in case Keir Starmer's watching.
Just to clarify, but it is important actually that women are in those roles. When I was growing up, there were women in leadership roles, people like Tessa Jowell, who went on to become a mentor of mine. I cannot tell you how much those women matter in those leadership roles. You know, people like Diane Abbott as well, really strong women who broke the mould and blazed a trail. It really matters, and I'm absolutely determined that our generation is not going to drop the ball on this, that we're going to keep seeing progress.
I remember during that Labour leadership contest, you said at one point that you'd quite like to see Queen Meghan. I just wonder how you're feeling about some of the coverage of Meghan Markle and Prince Harry. You're going to be watching the Oprah Winfrey interview.
I feel like I absolutely jinxed that. I should probably never have said it, because things have only got worse for the royal family since then. And I have to say that, my heart does go out to everybody involved in this. It's difficult being in the public eye. It's particularly difficult when your family is dragged into this. And what I see when I look at the royal family is a family going through a very difficult time. All of it being played out in public with maximum publicity. I think it would be far better for them if they were able to deal with this privately behind the scenes. And to be honest, I think it would be better for the country as well. They're having a very hard time, but so are hundreds of thousands of families in this country at the moment because of COVID. I think that they're the families that we ought to be focusing on.
OK, Lisa Nandy, thank you so much for being on the programme. Thank you.